Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey, one that begins in the quiet of my living room, as most of my travels do nowadays. The wind outside is cruel tonight, slapping bare branches against the windows, whistling through the cracks in the walls as if to remind me how lone this house can feel. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, lit a small candle on the bookshelf, and sat down with a blanket across my knees. Just as I always do when the ache of winter loneliness sets in. But then, my eyes fell upon it. A small carved statue I picked up at a flea market decades ago. It's black stone, heavy, and shaped like a seated figure in a crown. Most would mistake it for an ordinary replica of an Egyptian pharaoh. But I know better. The features are different. Broader nose, fuller lips, and a regal power in the posture that doesn't quite match the sculptures you find on postcards from Cairo. This is not a king of the Nile Delta. This is a king from the south. From Nubia. From Kush. You see, my dears, history has a way of hiding certain stories, pushing them into the corners of libraries, behind dusty curtains of academic jargon and, yes, prejudice. And tonight, I want to tell you about one of those stories. One that was almost erased. But not quite. It's the story of the Black Pharaohs. The rulers of Kush. A dynasty that once conquered and ruled Egypt itself. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you have a favorite piece of hidden history you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. I remember the first time I read about Kush. I was a university student, still in my 20s, wide-eyed and idealistic. My professor, a stern man with a trimmed white beard and a deep distrust of anything outside the Greco-Roman canon, brushed past a line in our textbook about Nubian interference during the Third Intermediate Period of Egypt. That's all it said. Interference. As if Kush were a mere footnote in Egypt's grand story. But that word, it sparked something in me. I went to the library that afternoon and dug deeper. And what I found, well, it changed how I see power, race, memory, and the strange, shifting tides of history. The kingdom of Kush was born along the southern reaches of the Nile, in what is today northern Sudan. While Egypt built its pyramids and painted its walls with gods and pharaohs, the people of Kush were watching, learning, building. They lived in the shadow of the great civilization to the north but were not simply imitators. They were traders, warriors, herders of cattle, and expert metal workers. Their land, rich with gold and ebony, gave them wealth and ambition. The Egyptians themselves called the region Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, for the Nubians' skill with archery. They respected them, feared them, even tried to dominate them. During Egypt's imperial heyday, Kush was annexed and ruled as a colony. But the people of Kush, resilient as the reeds that lined their riverbanks, never forgot who they were. Now imagine this, lovers. Centuries pass. Egypt weakens. Internal strife. Division between Lower and Upper Egypt. A slow crumble of what once was eternal. And in the south, Kush rises. Strong. Determined. Ready. This is where our real story begins. It is the 8th century BCE. And there, in the city of Napata, a man named Eleanor begins to stir the embers of empire. He lays the foundation for what would become the 25th dynasty of Egypt. But it is his successor, A remarkable man named Piye, who seizes the moment. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll talk about Piye properly soon. But tonight, just let me whisper this. The Nile did not always flow from Egyptian power to African subjugation. There was a moment, a shining moment, when black kings from the south marched north and claimed the double crown of Egypt. And they did so not with the goal of conquest, but with a dream of restoration. Isn't that something? In a world where we so often hear of conquest born from greed, here was a dynasty motivated by belief, by religion, by tradition, by a yearning to heal a fractured land. The pharaohs of Kush weren't just rulers. They were reformers, visionaries. They brought back temples that had crumbled, revived rituals that had faded, reasserted the divine order of Ma'at, the balance of the universe. And yet, when you open most history books today, where are they? Where are their names? Where are their deeds? Why have they been buried beneath centuries of silence? These questions haunted me as a student. They haunt me still. You see, I believe history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. And what we choose to forget. There's something heartbreaking about that little statue on my shelf. I bought it for a few coins from a seller who didn't know its origin. It sat on my desk for years, quietly watching me grade papers and sip coffee. I think of it now as a kind of relic. Not of a lost king, but of the lost respect. And perhaps that's what I'm chasing in these stories. Not just facts and names and dates, but the dignity of remembering, the grace of acknowledgement. Tonight, my dears, we've only just begun. The story of the Black Pharaohs is deeper than stone and sand. It's about what power looks like, who gets to wear the crown, and who gets written out of the script. And so I invite you to journey with me, downriver, into the heart of Africa, into the echoes of drums and temple chants, into the eyes of kings forgotten by most. But not by us. Not tonight. Not ever again. The fire crackles faintly as I sit back in my chair. The scent of old paper and lemon balm tea curling softly in the air. There's something about winter that slows the world down. Like a hush after a long conversation. And perhaps it's in that hush that stories rise to the surface. Unhurried and full of meaning. So let me take you now to the land of Kush. Not the mysterious kingdom that once conquered Egypt, but the land in its early days. A place of blazing sun, red earth, and a river that ran like a silver thread through the heart of the continent. Before Kush rose to challenge the pharaohs, it was already ancient. Yes. Even before Egypt's pyramids pierced the sky, the people of Nubia were living in organized societies. Some scholars now argue that Nubia, not Egypt, may have had the first monarchy along the Nile. Imagine that. And yet, how often do we hear this? The people of Kush weren't just inspired by Egypt. They were innovators in their own right. They built their own pyramids. Steeper, smaller, but no less symbolic. More than 200 of them still stand today in the sands of Sudan. Silent testaments to the kings and queens of a civilization too long forgotten. They forged iron. They traded ivory and incense. They fashioned gods that blended their own African spirituality with the deities of the north. And they had something else, too. Something Egypt, for all its splendor, lacked. Time. Kush endured for over 1,000 years. Shifting capitals from Napata to Meroe. Adapting. Surviving. And evolving in ways that the great kingdoms of the Mediterranean often could not. But let's return to the beginning of the 25th dynasty. Let's return to Alara. Now, Alara is a shadowed figure. Half legend, half king. The historical record is vague. But what we do know is this. He was likely the founder of the Kushite line that would eventually rule Egypt. His reign set the stage, laying the groundwork for the unification of Upper Nubia under one powerful throne. But more than just a political figure, Alara was remembered as a sacred king. His daughter, Amanirenas, would later become the god's wife of Amun, a religious title that granted her enormous influence in Thebes, heart of Upper Egypt's priesthood. Imagine that. A Nubian woman, daughter of a black king, serving as the divine intermediary in Egypt's holiest city. And that's just the beginning. As I sip my tea, I often wonder how it must have felt to be one of Alara's subjects. To live in Napata as the drums of destiny began to beat louder. To hear rumors from the north of Egypt's internal collapse, of feuding petty kings, of temples abandoned. And to realize, perhaps the gods were calling you to restore the balance. When we think of conquest, we think of swords and bloodshed. But in Kushite ideology, conquest was also restoration. These weren't kings seeking plunder. They believed they were heirs to Egypt's spiritual and political legacy. To them, they were the true defenders of Ma'at. Ah, Ma'at. That beautiful concept of balance, of order in the cosmos. It's one of my favorite ideas in all of history. Truly. So many modern systems, governments, economies, even families, seem to crumble under chaos and selfishness. But Ma'at insisted on harmony, reciprocity, truth. And the kings of Kush carried that ideal across the sands, like a torch passed from one civilization to the next. Now, from Alara's foundation rose Kushta, his brother or son, depending on which inscription you read. Kushta moved decisively. He took Thebes peacefully, a feat rarely acknowledged in Egyptian histories. He didn't invade. It's more accurate to say he assumed control. The priests of the moon welcomed him. Why? Because the old order in Egypt was crumbling. Fragmented. Weak. The priesthood longed for unity. For a powerful, pious king to restore the sacred balance. And Kushta, a Nubian, stepped forward. That moment, that quiet, dignified transfer of power, was monumental. It marked the beginning of Kushite presence in Egyptian rule. And yet, how many of us were taught it? If you learned about Egyptian history in school, chances are you were told of Ramses and Tutankhamun and Cleopatra. But not Piye, not Taharqa, not Shabaka, not the kings who came from the south, with dark skin and heavy crowns. It's a silence that speaks volumes. And sometimes, I fear, it's not accidental. Let me tell you a story. Back in the 1990s, when I was still teaching, I gave a lecture on the Nubian influence in Egypt. I mentioned the Kushite dynasty, how they ruled for nearly a century and brought stability back to a fractured land. After class, a fellow professor, lovely man, but very traditional, pulled me aside and said gently, "Eleanor, don't confuse the students. That period wasn't really Egyptian." Wasn't Egyptian? What does that even mean? You see, lovers, when power flows from north to south, it's called empire, civilization. But when it flows from south to north, suddenly, it becomes interference. A borrowed crown. A foreign chapter in the wrong book. And yet, the Kushite pharaohs ruled with reverence. They preserved temples. They restored festivals. They inscribed their triumphs not in conquest, but in piety. One inscription from Piye reads not like a military boast, but a prayer. I am not one who acts without ma'at, he writes. I listen to the words of the God. And I act accordingly. Now, I mustn't drift too far ahead. Piye's story will come soon. And it is a magnificent one. But for tonight, I want to leave you with a question. What makes a civilization authentic? Is it the land? The bloodline? Or is it the ideals that guide it? Because in many ways, Kush was more Egyptian than Egypt itself during those fractured years. It held fast to tradition when the North forgot. It walked in the steps of Osiris while others stumbled in greed. Perhaps history's greatest irony is this: that those who preserved the past were written out of its pages. But not here. Not with me. Not with us. The wind has calmed a little now, though I can still hear the occasional rustle of the pine tree just outside my window. My tea has long gone cold, but I can't bring myself to move. Stories like this one settle into the bones, don't they? We left off with Kushta, the steady hand who gently extended Kushite influence into Upper Egypt. But it was his son, Piye, who lit the fire, who would look northward and see not a foreign land, but a broken family in need of healing. And like a distant cousin returning to a house left in ruins, he didn't come with contempt, but with conviction. Now, let me tell you about Piye. He was a man of faith. Deep, unwavering faith. The kind that wasn't performative, but foundational. He was not just a warrior king. He was a philosopher king. And to understand his campaign into Egypt, you have to understand the way he saw the world. Piye believed in Ma'at. That same ancient ideal I mentioned before. Order. Justice. Balance. And he looked at Egypt in the 8th century BCE and saw the opposite. Chaos. The once mighty kingdom was fractured, overrun with petty warlords and rival dynasts. Temples had fallen silent. Sacred festivals went uncelebrated. The gods were neglected. It wasn't just political disorder. It was cosmic disorder. And Piye saw it as his duty to restore it. His campaign into Egypt was not a lightning invasion. It was more like a slow pilgrimage. Temple by temple. City by city. As he advanced, he didn't raze or plunder. He offered prayers. He cleansed altars. He demanded loyalty. Yes. But always couched it in divine legitimacy. When Piye reached Thebes, he didn't treat it as a conquered prize. He entered it as a pilgrim. He bathed in the sacred waters. He offered incense to Amun. He stood before the great pylons of Karnak and declared himself not as a foreign invader, but as the true servant of the gods. And the people believed him. Even the priests of Amun, the stewards of Upper Egypt's spiritual power, embraced him. Can you imagine that? A black king from Nubia walking into Egypt's holiest temple and being crowned not with resistance, but reverence. Now, of course, not everyone welcomed him. There were northern warlords, like Tefnut of Say, who rallied against him. The Delta region was fiercely independent, suspicious of any centralized authority. And so Piye did something extraordinary. He launched what we now call the Piye campaign. A brilliant series of military maneuvers up the Nile, capturing key cities one by one. But here's the part I love most. After defeating his rivals, he didn't stay. He returned to Kush. He left his vassals to govern in Egypt and went back to Napata, to the land of his ancestors. Isn't that astonishing? Piye had conquered Egypt, been accepted as Pharaoh, restored the gods, and then walked away. Why? Because power, to Piye, was not about control. It was about order. And once that order had been re-established, he felt no need to linger. There's a stone stela, one of the few surviving records of his reign, where Piye recounts his victories. But even that text reads more like a spiritual testament than a military boast. He writes about the joy of entering sacred temples, the satisfaction of seeing rituals restored. His words are soaked in reverence. I remember reading that inscription for the first time, hunched over a translation in the university library. I had tears in my eyes. Not because of the grandeur, but because of the humility. In a world so often obsessed with domination, here was a king whose greatest triumph was restoration. Of course, not all historians agree with that rosy view. Some argue that Piye's withdrawal was more strategic than spiritual, that he didn't have the resources to hold the delta, or that his vassals weren't strong enough to maintain control. And that may be true. In part. History is rarely simple. But still, I find Piye's actions remarkable. And I think they challenge something deep within us. This idea that power must always be held, that conquest must always be permanent, that legacy is about how long you sit on the throne. Piye tells us otherwise. Sometimes, legacy is about what you choose not to take. Now, I must share with you something more personal. Years ago, I taught a student named Malik. Brilliant, soft-spoken, and endlessly curious. One afternoon, he came to my office clutching a paper he'd written on Piye. He had tears in his eyes. My grandmother, he told me, used to say there were kings in our blood. I always thought it was just a story. But now I know. It's true. That moment has stayed with me all these years. Because history, when told honestly, doesn't just inform. It restores. It restores dignity. It restores identity. It tells young men and women that their ancestors didn't only suffer. They ruled. That they didn't just survive. They shaped civilization. The Black Pharaohs, especially Piye, offer a counter-narrative. They remind us that Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, but the cradle of kingship, wisdom, and spiritual leadership. And yet, they were almost lost to time. Almost. You know, there's a soft sadness in thinking of all the schoolchildren who never heard Piye's name. All the maps that stopped at Egypt's southern border. As if the Nile simply ended there. But not tonight. Tonight, we've brought Piye back into the light. And in the glow of this candle, as the snow finally begins to fall again, I can almost imagine him standing on the banks of the Nile, looking northward. Not with greed, but with solemn hope. A hope that the gods would return. That order would return. That history, one day, would remember him. And now, we do. It's nearly midnight now. The wind has picked up again, howling low, like some ancient voice swirling through the branches outside. I wrapped another shawl around my shoulders, the blue one with the worn fringe, and relit the candle. Funny how the smallest rituals, warm tea, soft lamplight, a familiar chair, can anchor us when we're navigating memories older than our bones. Tonight, we follow the line of Piye into the reign of his successors. You see, when Piye died, he didn't leave behind just a kingdom. He left behind a vision, a sacred charge to preserve Ma'at, and a dynasty of men ready to bear it. Chief among them was his brother, or possibly his son, depending on the records. A ruler named Shabaka. Now Shabaka, oh, he was a different kind of man. Where Piye was serene, spiritual, a restorer, Shabaka was pragmatic, a consolidator. He moved quickly to solidify Kushite power in Egypt. In fact, he didn't just inherit his brother's legacy. He fortified it. He took control of Memphis, the great city of the north, and made it the administrative heart of the Kushite-ruled Egypt. It was a bold move, strategic, and perhaps a little risky, because Memphis had long been a center of Egyptian resistance, a city where northern warlords had clung to their power, suspicious of these southern kings and Thebes. But Shabaka wasn't intimidated. He moved in, declared himself pharaoh, and placed the double crown firmly on his brow. And then, in one of the most remarkable acts of his reign, he issued a decree to preserve ancient knowledge. Not to destroy it. Not to rewrite it. But to protect it. He ordered his scribes to copy a fading religious text onto a block of black stone. That stone still exists today. We call it the Shabaka stone. It contains one of the earliest known theological discourses from ancient Egypt. The Memphite theology. A creation story centered around the god Ptah. Scholars are still debating its meanings, but the intent is clear. Shabaka understood that power wasn't just about military campaigns or temple building. It was about memory. He preserved a dying philosophy, chiseled it into stone, and by doing so, kept it alive for over 2,000 years. Now, let's pause for a moment. Isn't that extraordinary? A black African king, once labeled an outsider, a usurper, made it his mission to preserve Egyptian theology, to save the heart of a civilization that had once viewed his ancestors as inferior. He didn't burn their texts. He didn't erase their gods. He saved them. And yet, how many textbooks tell you that? It makes me think of a question I once posed to my students. We were discussing cultural appropriation. How dominant cultures often borrow from others without giving credit. Or worse, reframe that history to suit their narrative. But what about the reverse? What happens when a marginalized group inherits the legacy of a dominant one and chooses not vengeance, but reverence? That was Shabaka's path. And it wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. He knew that to rule Egypt, he didn't need to make it more Nubian. He needed to remind it of what it had once been. A land of gods and ritual. A place of order and cosmic harmony. Of course, not everyone appreciated that. There were whispers, grumblings, northern elites who muttered about foreign rulers, even as they attended temple ceremonies and accepted royal favors. The Delta, in particular, remained restless. It's tempting to read this period as peaceful, but it wasn't entirely. Shabaka may have ruled from Memphis, but he was always looking over his shoulder. Always aware that power, even when divinely ordained, is never truly secure. Still, he reigned for over a decade. Some sources say 2. And in that time, he continued the work Piye began. Building temples, re-establishing priestly orders, And most of all, proving that a Nubian king could wear the crown of Egypt not just with legitimacy, but with grace. And then came Taharqa. Ah! Taharqa, the jewel of the dynasty, the most famous of the Black Pharaohs, and perhaps the most tragic. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's linger a little longer with Shabaka. There's a temple ruin in Karnak, less grand than others, crumbling now under centuries of silence. I remembered standing there once, running my fingers along the faded cartouche of his name, barely legible after all these years. Tourists walked past it without a glance. But I stayed. Because in those worn-out hieroglyphs, I saw something more than a name. I saw a man who refused to be erased. Shabaka wasn't flashy. He didn't fight legendary battles or carve his face into every obelisk. But he carved his legacy in memory, in theology, in preservation, in patience. And maybe that's why I admire him so deeply. Because history loves noise. But often, it's the quiet ones who keep the world turning. There's a lesson in that, isn't there? Especially today, when we so often mistake volume for vision. When our attention spans reward scandal over substance. But Shabaka, he worked in silence. And still, his stone speaks. Now, let me share with you a lesser-known story. It's about a man named Hormaket, a priest who served in Thebes during Shabaka's reign. We know of him only through a handful of inscriptions, but they tell us this. He was Nubian by birth, Egyptian by office. He administered temple rites, oversaw religious festivals, and was beloved by his community. His tomb inscription ends with a phrase that struck me like thunder when I first read it. He walked in two lands, but served one truth. Isn't that beautiful? In Hormaket, we see the quiet triumph of this dynasty. Not just in kingship, but in integration. Not cultural erasure, but cultural embrace. And perhaps that's what made the Black Pharaohs so dangerous to later narratives. Because they didn't just conquer. They belonged. They ruled Egypt not as foreigners, but as heirs. And so I ask you, lovers, when we write history, who do we remember? And who do we allow to belong? It's a question that still haunts museums and textbooks. One that echoes every time a young person is told that their ancestors didn't build, didn't reign, didn't matter. But in Shabaka's quiet reign, in the temple he preserved, in the theology he safeguarded, we find another answer. Yes, they did. And their memory still breathes, stone by stone, word by word. There's a certain stillness that descends around this time of night. A hush that's not quite silence, but something gentler. As if the world has paused just long enough for the past to whisper. I leaned back in my chair just now and closed my eyes, imagining the torchlight flickering against sandstone, the rustle of linen robes, the chant of priests echoing through temple halls built under a night sky scattered with stars. And now, dears, now we come to Taharqa. His name alone sends a thrill through my spine. Because if Piye was the visionary, and Shabaka the preserver, then Taharqa was the star. The one whose name stretched furthest. Across borders. Across time. His was the most dazzling reign of them all. And, sadly, the one most challenged. He came to power young. Possibly as young as 20. But oh, how he burned with ambition and charisma. The kind of ruler whose very presence commands attention. His image was carved everywhere. Strong. Idealized. often depicted offering to the gods with an almost ethereal calm. But behind those serene carvings was a king under siege. You see, the world around Egypt and Kush was changing. And fast. From the east, a new power had emerged, rising like a storm over the Zagros Mountains. The Assyrian Empire. Now, lovers, if you've never heard of the Assyrians, let me assure you, they were not the kind of neighbors you'd want. Their kings were ruthless. Their armies, vast and organized. They had war down to a science. Siege towers, iron weapons, of brutal efficiency. And they had one particular king who would change the course of Taharka's story. Esarhaddon. But we'll come back to that. First, let me tell you what made Taharka's reign so extraordinary. He was a builder. Oh, a glorious builder. Temples, shrines, pylons. He expanded the sacred complexes of Karnak, erected grand projects across Nubia, and adorned the lands of the Nile with monuments to his gods and his dynasty. Many of these temples still stand, half buried in sand or half sunk beneath the rising waters of the Nile. But their grandeur lingers. And not just in stone. Taharka had vision. He understood the power of image. He aligned himself deeply with the god Amun, presenting himself as the divine instrument of restoration. He used theology not just as faith, but as policy. There's one inscription from the Temple of Kawa that captures his voice. I was among them, and none dared speak. I was a lion who entered their midst. I gave breath to what was dying. It reads like poetry, doesn't it? That's how he saw himself. Not merely as a king, but as breath itself. Life to a land struggling to remember its soul. But dreams, no matter how noble, must face the realities of the world. And in Taharka's time, the world was tilting. Assyria had its eyes on Egypt. They saw a divided land. Rich, symbolic, strategically vital. And they were coming. Taharka, to his credit, did not run. He resisted. He fortified the north, sent envoys, tried to unify fractious allies. He stood not just as a Kushite king, but as Egypt's shield. In doing so, he became a rare figure. An African monarch standing toe-to-toe with one of the greatest military empires the world had yet seen. And for a while, he held them off. There's something beautifully defiant about that. A black African king, leading a coalition of Egyptians and Nubians against the imperial might of Assyria. He wasn't just defending his kingdom. He was defending the memory of every stone his ancestors had placed before him. But the tide was too strong. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon launched a massive campaign. He swept through the delta, took Memphis, and forced Taharka to flee southward. It was a bitter retreat. A moment of deep humiliation for a man who had given so much to unify the two lands. But Taharka didn't break. From Thebes and Napata, he regrouped. He staged another resistance. He reoccupied Memphis. He defied Esarhaddon until the very end. It would be his nephew, Tantamani, who would take up the struggle after him. But the writing was already on the wall. Assyria was too vast, too brutal. And Egypt, well, Egypt had begun to forget. Yes, there it is again. That word? Forget. Because by the end of the 25th dynasty, Egyptian elites in the Delta were already turning toward collaboration with the Assyrians. The old dream of Ma'at? Of unity? of restoration through faith? That was Taharka's dream. But dreams don't always survive betrayal. Still, even in defeat, Taharka left a legacy. His monuments remain among the most beautiful of the period. His theology reshaped Kushite and Egyptian religious thought. And his image, majestic, defiant, can still be found in temples from Sudan to Upper Egypt. There's one particular statue of him, now housed in the British Museum, I believe. A granite figure, serene and strong, with eyes that seem to see across centuries. I remembered standing before it once, years ago. School children were bustling past. But I stood still. I looked into those eyes and whispered, "They didn't erase you, Taharka. We remember." And that, I think, is the quiet miracle of history. That it survives, even when buried. That it speaks, even when silenced. Let me leave you tonight with a question that often lingers after I teach about Taharka. What if history had gone another way? What if Egypt had fully embraced the Kushite dynasty? What if Assyria had faltered? What would Africa's story look like today? We cannot know. But we can remember. And sometimes, remembrance is a form of justice. The candle beside me has burned low, its little pool of wax clinging to the edge of the saucer I placed underneath. I don't dare blow it out yet. There's still warmth to be drawn from its soft light. Still stories in the air. My fingers curl slightly from the evening chill. But my mind is wide awake. Wrapped in stone, song, and shadow. Because now, lovers, we arrive at one of the most beautiful contradictions of the Kushite dynasty. How they ruled with reverence, but were erased without resistance. You see, after Taharka's death and his nephew Tantamani's brief, heroic stand, the 25th dynasty came to its end in Egypt. The Assyrians pushed south. Egypt's native rulers in the north reclaimed power, with their allegiance to Nineveh, not Napata. And the Black Pharaohs retreated, crossing the first cataract and returning to their homeland in Kush. But that wasn't the end. Not for them. Because even in defeat, the Kushite kings never lost their dignity. And in many ways, their greatest flowering came after they left Egypt. They returned to Napata first, that sacred capital nestled between cliffs and desert. But eventually, the seat of power shifted further south, to a place that sounds like music when you say it aloud. Meroe. Ah. Meroe. If Piye was the breath, Shabaka the memory, and Taharka the flame, then Meroe was the echo. A glittering world built by those who had once ruled an empire and now turned inward to build something no less radiant. Located between the Nile and the Atbara rivers, Meroe became a center of art, architecture, commerce, and learning. It was African in character, no longer trying to prove itself to Egypt, but proud in its own right. And yes, they built pyramids there. Dozens. Hundreds. In fact. But these were not the pyramids of Giza. Those clean-cut geometric marvels. The Meroitic pyramids were smaller, steeper, sometimes clustered tightly together like a family of sleeping giants. Their doors faced east, toward the rising sun, and their chapels were adorned with rich carvings. Scenes of kings before the gods, queens in long flowing garments, celestial animals and sacred rites. I visited Meroe once, long ago. Not in person. No. I wish I could have. But in my dreams. After poring over photographs and dig reports and artist renderings late into the night, I would close my eyes and walk those sands. Let the wind hum through the stones. I could almost hear the chants of priests echoing between the tombs. The footsteps of scribes hurrying from one temple to another. There's magic in Meroe. And sorrow, too. Because you see, lovers, Meroe is still a mystery. For centuries, archaeologists tried to unlock its secrets. They uncovered cities, baths, temples. But one thing remained out of reach. The language. The Kushites of Meroe developed their own script. A written form of the Meroitic language. Unrelated to Egyptian hieroglyphs. It appears on tombs. On temple walls. On stelaeon jars. But we can't read it. Not fully. Not yet. It's one of the last undeciphered written languages from the ancient world. And that. Oh. That takes in my historian's heart. Because within those symbols, lovers, are voices waiting to be heard. Names of queens and children. Prayers to gods we no longer know. Laws. Poems. Perhaps even jokes or lullabies. A whole civilization speaking from the dust. But we've lost the key. It makes me wonder. How much of human history is waiting quietly, written and forgotten? We talk so often about lost cities and sunken temples. But how about lost meaning? To me, the script of Meroe is the purest metaphor for the Black Pharaohs. Present. Real. Enduring. Yet so often unread. Let me share a lesser-known story here. One that rarely makes the textbooks. In the early 20th century, an excavation near Meroe uncovered the tomb of a queen named Amanirenas. She ruled long after the 25th dynasty. When Rome, not Assyria, was Egypt's master. And yet, her spirit was pure Kushite. Fierce. Proud. Utterly unwilling to submit. When Augustus. Yes. That Augustus. First emperor of Rome. Demanded tribute. Amanirenas marched her armies north and sacked a Roman outpost. According to some accounts, she even took the head off a statue of Augustus and buried it beneath the steps of a Kushite temple. So that every worshipper, every visitor, would step on the Roman emperor's head as they entered. That, lovers, is not erasure. That is resistance. And yet, outside a few scholarly circles, who knows her name? Why isn't Queen Amanirenas celebrated alongside Cleopatra? Why do we allow the edges of the map to fade into silence, when they are often where the fiercest stories burn brightest? I once posed that question to a classroom full of teenagers. One young girl, bright, serious, determined, raised her hand and said quietly, "Because power decides who gets remembered." She was right. But perhaps now, in these quiet hours of night, as we light our candles and speak their names aloud, we take back some of that power. Perhaps memory is its own form of rebellion. And Meroe, with its pyramids, its language, its queens of fire and stone, becomes not a footnote, but a beacon. A whisper from the past, saying, "We were here. We mattered. We still do." Outside, the snow has started again. Slow and fine. Like powdered sugar drifting through moonlight. I reached for my old shawl once more. Folded it across my lap. And let my fingers trace its embroidered edge. Loop after loop. Stitch after stitch. My mother taught me to sew. Said every thread was a kind of memory. A record. She called it. In cloth instead of ink. And just now, as I think of Merowe's language, undeciphered, but not silent, I realize how many records we've lost simply because we forgot how to listen. Tonight, let's talk about voices we were never meant to forget. Let's talk about the women of Kush. Oh yes. Lovers. The queens. The mothers. The warriors. The goddesses carved into stone. Not as background, but as rulers. Unlike Egypt, where female pharaohs were rare exceptions, Kush saw women as sovereigns in their own right. They bore the title Gandake, or as the Greeks rendered it, Cantus, a name that once echoed from the cataracts of the Nile to the scrolls of Roman scribes. And these Kandakes, they were no ceremonial figures. They led armies. They negotiated with emperors. They ruled as queens and kings. Let me paint a scene for you. Imagine a royal court in Merowe. Incense curling through the air. At its center, a woman sits. Not behind a man, but on the throne itself. Her headdress gleams with gold. Her eyes, dark and unflinching, survey the gathered diplomats. A Roman envoy steps forward, bearing gifts and demands. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't smile. She commands. That woman could have been Amanirenas, one of the most powerful Kandakes, whose pyramid at Merowe still stands, adorned with reliefs of her offering to gods. Or perhaps it was Amanirenas, another queen who reigned jointly with the male co-ruler, her image carved across temples as an equal. Now, here's something that will surprise you. When early European archaeologists found these tombs, they were baffled. They assumed the women depicted in crowns and regalia must have been wives of kings. Or simply misunderstood. But they weren't misunderstood. They were misread. Because in so much of ancient history, especially the history told by men, power is supposed to have a certain shape. A masculine shape. But in Kush, it flowed differently. And that's part of why the memory of Kush was buried. Because it challenged the dominant story. Because it offered a version of Africa that was proud, powerful, matriarchal, and that made some people uncomfortable. I'll never forget a moment in my second year of teaching. I had brought in a picture of Queen Amanirenas, standing tall beside her co-ruler in one of the reliefs from Naka. Her figure was robust. Her stance assertive. She held the crook and flail, the traditional symbols of pharaonic authority. One of my students, a young girl named Nadia, stared at that image for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said, "I've never seen a queen like that before." She didn't mean just in history. She meant in anything. That moment stays with me. Because when we erase these stories, we don't just lose history. We lose possibility. We lose the idea that power can look like a woman with dark skin, broad shoulders, and a gaze that pierces marble. That a queen can wield a sword. That a ruler can wear earrings and still command armies. And yet, these queens remain so little known. Where is the movie about Amanirenas? Where are the documentaries on Amanirenas' gold treasure? Looted and scattered across European museums. Where is the honor we owe them? Let me share one more image with you. A piece of a temple wall, unearthed from the sand, showing a queen. Not in the background. Not offering to a male god, but receiving the breath of life from the gods themselves. The divine ankh placed at her nose, as if to say, "You are chosen. You are life. You are ruler." That, to me, is revolutionary. And perhaps what makes the women of Kush so captivating is not just their power, but their balance. They ruled fiercely. Yes. But also maternally. Their images show strength and tenderness, divinity and humanity. They were not perfect. They were not mythical. They were real. And they were erased. Not by time, but by decision. And that is the difference, isn't it? Time wears things down. But decisions, textbook omissions, museum labels, careless lectures, bury things. The good news, lovers, is that we can decide. We can decide to remember. We can whisper the name Kandake into the quiet of the night. We can speak of queens who once stood between two worlds, Africa and Egypt, divine and human, and ruled them both. And in doing so, we stitch their memory back together, thread by thread, word by word. So tonight, I invite you to sit quietly for a moment and imagine them, those towering queens, standing beneath stars that shone no differently than ours. They held staffs and scrolls. They issued laws. They kissed their children goodnight, then prepared for battle at dawn. They were not footnotes. They were sovereign. And now, finally, their names are being spoken again. In podcasts. In classrooms. In soft midnight ramblings from an old woman's cozy chair. That, too, is a kind of justice. The house is quiet now. Not even the floorboards creak. Just the soft hum of the radiator and the occasional flick of candlelight dancing against the spines of old books. I take comfort in this kind of stillness. It makes room for stories to surface. Especially the uncomfortable ones. Because not all stories from Kush are triumphant. Some are stories of theft. Of silencing. Of how entire civilizations are edited out of memory. Tonight, my dears, we must talk about something that still stirs anger in my old bones. The deliberate erasure of the Black Pharaohs by later empires, scholars, and even museum curators. Let's begin with the uncomfortable truth. Much of what we now know about the kingdom of Kush, its pyramids, temples, statues, was uncovered not by those who sought to celebrate it, but by those who saw it as curiosity. A side note. A primitive imitation of Egypt. That belief? It lingers still. I recall a museum tour years ago. A small group. Maybe 12 people. We stopped in front of a granite statue. Broad-nosed. Full-lipped. Unmistakably Kushite in style. The placard beneath it read simply, Pharaoh. 25th Dynasty. No name. No origin. No mention of Kush. I raised my hand gently and asked the guide, "Who is this pharaoh?" He blinked. Flipped through a pamphlet. Then shrugged. "We think it might be one of the Nubian ones. They didn't rule long." Didn't rule long? A century. My dear boy. That's longer than many celebrated European monarchs. And they didn't just rule. They restored. They built. They believed. But that's how erasure works. It doesn't require fire. Just silence. You see, when European explorers arrived in Sudan in the 19th century, they were shocked to find pyramids at Meroe. They had expected deserts. Sand. Perhaps some tribes. But grand stone pyramids. Written language? Queens and kings carved into temple walls? It didn't fit their narrative. So they invented a new one. They claimed the ruins were inspired by Egypt. Or worse, the result of Egyptian colonists migrating south. They could not, would not, accept that a great African civilization could rise parallel to Egypt. And at times, above it. Even today, maps of ancient civilizations often cut off at Aswan. As if the Nile ends there. As if beyond lies only shadow. Let me share a story that still haunts me. In 1834, Giuseppe Ferrolini, a treasure hunter from Italy, arrived in Meroe. He didn't come to learn. He came to loot. He blew the tops off dozens of pyramids, dynamiting his way into tombs in search of gold. And he found it. He raided the tomb of Queen Amanirenas and stole her regalia. Crowns, rings, bracelets, all exquisitely crafted. He tried to sell the treasure in Europe, but no one believed it came from Africa. Too sophisticated, they said. Must be fake. It wasn't until the Berlin Museum agreed to display them that the pieces found a home. But even there, they were shown as exotic oddities, not royal African artifacts. To this day, Amanirenas' jewelry, her crown, mind you, rests in a European museum, thousands of miles from the land she ruled. And no one asked her permission. We talk often, lovers, about the repatriation of art, but it's not just about objects. It's about stories. It's about whether a culture is allowed to tell its own tale, or if someone else writes the ending. That's why the erasure of the Black Pharaohs is not just historical oversight. It is historical violence. Because the consequences aren't confined to textbooks. They bleed into identity. I've taught students, bright, beautiful black students, who had never heard of Kush, who thought their history began with slavery. Can you imagine that? To grow up believing your ancestors were never kings, that you come from silence. I remember a boy named Darius. He was quiet, skeptical. But the day we discussed the 25th Dynasty, he stayed after class. So wait, he said, holding the edge of his desk. Black people ruled Egypt? I nodded. Not just ruled, I said. They restored it. He blinked. Then he smiled. Not a wide grin. Just a small, stunned softening. Like the world had tilted just slightly in his favor for the first time. That's why I tell these stories. Because there are still Daruzas out there. Still queens waiting to be named. Still pyramids half buried under sand and shame. And lovers, let us not pretend this is only about Africa. Every culture has its erased dynasties. Its lost queens. Its misnamed monuments. What makes Kush unique is how visible it was, and how quickly it was made invisible. A statue removed from its label. A crown displayed without context. A dynasty dismissed in a single sentence. But we can read between the lines, can't we? We can remember that the Black Pharaohs were not minor kings. They were visionaries. Builders. Guardians of an ideal. And now, we can be their guardians. Not by speaking over them, but by making space. For truth. For nuance. For memory. So next time you see a nameless statue in a museum, lean close. Whisper a name. Whisper Piye. Or Taharka. Or Amanirenas. Whisper Kush. Because even if the world has forgotten, we, tonight, have not. I stepped away just now to refill my teacup. The kitchen was dark except for the soft amber glow of the stove light. And as I waited for the kettle to boil again, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, it startled me. Not because of the silver in my hair or the tired beneath my eyes, but because I suddenly realized, this face, mine, would one day be forgotten too. Unless someone remembered. Unless someone chose to. That's the heart of all this, isn't it? The Black Pharaohs. The queens of Cush. The builders of Meroe. They didn't just vanish. They were forgotten by design. And yet, their fingerprints are everywhere. In stone. In gold. In stories that refuse to die. And perhaps nowhere is that more achingly obvious than in the places where their memory has been misplaced. Or worse. Deliberately renamed. Let's go. For a moment. To the grand museums of the West. London. Paris. Berlin. Boston. Walk their wide marble halls and you'll find Egypt everywhere. Sarcophagi under glass. Mummies wrapped and pinned like relics of some divine experiment. Golden masks gleaming under dim spotlights. But Cush? Often tucked into a dim corner. Labeled vaguely. Nubian period, or Sudanese dynasty. Rarely given context. Rarely granted the reverence it deserves. I remember once visiting the British Museum. I had traveled all that way just to see the statue of Taharqa. A granite colossus found in Karnak. His name still clear. His form still proud. But when I found it, there was no plaque explaining that he was a king of both Cush and Egypt. No mention of his resistance against Assyria. No recognition of his role as the last great pharaoh before Egypt fell into foreign domination. Just a date. A dynasty number. And silence. You see, lovers. Empires don't just take land. They take narrative. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, as colonial powers carved up Africa, they carved up its past too. Egypt was claimed as part of the cradle of civilization. Suitable for admiration and romanticization. But Nubia? Cush. Meroe. Too African. Too dark. Too proud. So instead of celebrating the Black Pharaohs, scholars cast them as imitators. Foreigners who borrowed Egypt's greatness instead of co-creating it. And thus, the dynasty that restored Egypt's order was framed as an interruption. Even the famed Temple of Karnak, which the Cushites helped restore, often omits their names in public signage. The sections they built are rarely highlighted. As if they merely passed through. Rather than reanimating the sacred stones with breath and vision. But the stones remember. In Sudan. At Gabal Barkal. A holy mountain and sacred site for the Cushite kings. You can still find temples built by Piye and Taharqa. Carved deep into the rock. They believed the mountain was the home of a moon. And so they built shrines in its shadow. Shaping sanctuaries where the divine could meet the human. I once showed a photograph of Gabal Barkal to a class of high schoolers. One boy asked, "Why don't we learn about this in school?" And I had to pause before I answered. Because the honest answer is, some people decided it wasn't important. But we know better now. Don't we? We know that Cush wasn't just Egypt's shadow. It was its mirror. And sometimes, it was the torch that relit the flame. Let me share a personal confession. For many years, I avoided this topic in my public lectures. Not because I didn't love it. Oh, I adored the story of the Black Pharaohs. But because I worried. Worried people wouldn't believe me. that they'd say, "You're romanticizing." Or worse, "That's not real history." But as I've grown older, and perhaps a little bolder, I've come to understand something. If we don't tell the full story, someone else will tell the half story forever. So now, when I speak about Kush, I speak it loud. I tell of kings with dark skin and open hearts, of queens who ruled temples and battlefields alike, of scribes who wrote in symbols we still can't read, but whose silence speaks volumes. And I remind my listeners, like I'm reminding you now, that history is not set in stone. It can be rescued, rewritten, remembered. Not remembered in the sense of memory, but remembered. Stitched back together from fragments, restored to wholeness, limb by sacred limb. There's a hymn from the pyramid texts of Egypt that says, "You shall not decay. You shall not rot. You shall rise again with the morning sun." The Egyptians meant it for their kings. But tonight, I whisper it for the Black Pharaohs. For every name removed from a plaque, every face missing from a textbook, every voice lost to the sands of empire. You shall not decay. You shall not rot. You shall rise again. With memory. And with us. The candle has almost reached its base now. Its little flame flickers like a heartbeat. Steady but slow. My tea is long gone, and the sky outside has lightened ever so slightly. Dawn is just a breath away. And I find myself thinking, not just about the Black Pharaohs, but about how we all fade. Eventually. How empires crumble. And names wear smooth with time. Like river stones. And yet, tonight, we've remembered. And that remembering has power. Let's return once more to the kingdom of Kush. After Egypt. After the wars. After the losses. Let's return to what they became. Because the story doesn't end with Taharka's defeat. Nor with Amanirenas' resistance. Nor even with the silence of the museums. The people of Kush endured. They continued to rule from Meroe for centuries. They developed art, music, fashion. Yes, fashion. That was distinctly Kushite. They wore elaborate jewelry, embraced bright colors, and built towns bustling with markets and laughter and ritual. This wasn't a people broken by history. They were transformed by it. And they transformed history in turn. Even as Rome expanded, as trade routes shifted, as Christian and later Islamic kingdoms rose around them, Kush left a legacy. Some scholars believe echoes of their traditions survived in later Nubian Christian kingdoms, like Makuria. Others find traces in Sudanese oral storytelling. There are folk songs in the Nile Valley that speak of queens riding lions and kings who command rivers. I've always wondered if, beneath the poetry, lies memory. Not literal history, but something just as powerful. Cultural memory. Spiritual truth. You know, lovers, we often speak of dead civilizations, but civilizations don't die. They sleep. And sometimes, all it takes is a voice. A whisper in the night. A story shared over tea. To stir them awake. Let me tell you a moment that changed me. Years ago, I met a Sudanese man in a bookshop. We struck up a conversation near the history section, as old ladies like me are wont to do. He noticed I was holding a book on Meroe and smiled. My grandmother used to say, he told me, that our blood is royal. That once we ruled the two lands. I never understood what she meant. until I came across the name Piye. His voice trembled a little. And then he said something I've never forgotten. They buried our kings. But they didn't bury our pride. What a thing to carry in your bones. What a thing to pass on to your children. That's why these stories matter. Not because they are perfect or uncomplicated, but because they restore dignity. They remind us that Africa was not only enslaved, it was crowned. That blackness in history is not only resistance, it is origin. It is rule. It is reverence. And now, as the final chapter of this journey draws near, I want to speak directly to anyone listening who has ever felt erased. If the maps stopped at your borders, if the textbooks skipped your ancestors, if the statues in museums never looked like your grandparents, know this. You come from kings, from queens, from people who prayed to stars and built monuments that outlasted empires. And if you've forgotten, it's not your fault. It was done to you. But now, we undo it. Together. In memory. In story. In the gentle unfolding of a name whispered at midnight. So let's whisper them again. One last time. Piye, the restorer. Shabaka, the preserver. Taharka, the defiant. Amanishakheto, the radiant. Amanirenas, the lion-hearted. Amanitor, the queen who ruled in partnership. Kush, the land that held Egypt in its arms, not as a servant, but as a sibling. Let history remember them. Let us remember them. And let us speak their stories into the quiet, until the silence breaks, and their pyramids rise again. Not just in the sand, but in our imagination, in our pride, in our dreams.